John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 74. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. While John was on a vacation in the United States of America, specifically New York City, he was spotted by an old rival named Papa Midnight. And because John came here for vacation, kind of to find himself again after he was homeless on the street for a while, his guard was down and he wasn't expecting anyone to try to hurt or mess with him. But when Papa Midnight found out that John was here, he saw that John's guard was down. So he decided to attack John and send him witch walking, he called it, which basically leaves John's body here in our reality, but takes his mind to a hellscape reality of New York City. So John has been trying to figure out what's going on, and it took him a while, but finally he did kind of figure out that he is in some sort of hell dimension. And he figured this out because at the end of the last issue, he was approached by a man who had been walking a very long way to find John, and that person was the former president, John F. Kennedy. We left off with the last issue with Kennedy introducing himself to John, and John looking dumbstruck, and that's why he realized that if there are dead people here, then he must be in hell. So first things first, with issue 74, we got the cover. We get a nice big picture of a western landscape. So there's a vast desert, but there's also these rocky plateaus that are scattered throughout the landscape. And on the plateau closest to us, there is a skeleton Native American person riding a skeleton horse overlooking this desert landscape. And behind the Native American, we see a white arm holding up a very large rose flower. And we can also see that this is written by Garth Ennis with art by Steve Dillon. And as we turn to the first page, we see 3 stacked horizontal panels. The one on top has Papa Midnight smiling. The one in the middle is Sedella, his sister's skull. And the third is the partial face of the first of the fallen. And over these images, the narration says, "You took yourself a little piece of hell, and you threw him in, and now you watch him suffer. But your sister, she did all the work. She's been doing it for 30 years since you threw her down below, and you think she's your tool and spy, but she has her own ideas. She's pulling strings and prodding fate, and he's met a man who'll help him out, but she won't let you see. All you see is what she wants. But I can see. For whoever's in the White House, I'm always on the throne." So it seems this was like some narration from the first of the Fallen's perspective, because he's watching what Papa Midnight is doing to John, and also what his sister Sedella is trying to do behind Papa Midnight's back. Then we cut to John and JFK walking in hell, and it seems they've already been talking for a while, because we come into the middle of their conversation as John is asking, "Deal?" And JFK responds in agreement, "I believe it is safe to announce that at this point, after brief negotiation, we have indeed reached a settlement. Will you give your word as a servant of your British Queen that you will honor this agreement?" And John reaches out his hand and says, "Let's just shake on it, all right, mate?" But JFK doesn't remove his hand from the back of his head, and he says, "Unfortunately, I am unable to do so at this time, and it pains me greatly as the President of the United States of America that this should be the case. However, the removal of my hand from my head will result in a loss of facilities, which could eventually become a destabilizing force at some point in my personal future." And John replies, "You mean you've had to hold your brains in ever since you got shot through the head?" And if you remember at the beginning of the last issue when JFK was introduced, they showed him walking, and they also mentioned that he was kind of lying to himself, that he didn't want to actually admit that he had gotten shot. So when John mentions it, he doesn't really want to acknowledge it, but he says, I I regard that as mere supposition, one that would be unwise to make until all the facts are in. And to that, John says, I can see this is going to be a bundle of laughs. Bollocks to it. Wagons ho. And the reason John said that is because they have been walking out of the city, so we can see the New York skyline fading behind them, and then we see them walking on a desolate piece of highway in the middle of nowhere in a desert, but we can see them passing a sign that says Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Damnation's Flame Part 3, Trail of Tears. Then we cut to John's body in the homeless shelter that he was dropped off at in the last issue. And the last time we saw John in this place, he was being urinated on by one of the fellow homeless men in this place. And it seems after that man pissed on John, him and a couple other homeless guys began stealing John's clothes because one of them has John's jacket in his hand and he says, could have waited till I got his coat off before pissing on his ass, Murray. And then Murray turns to that man and calls him a slur for a gay person. And the man with the jacket doesn't like that and he says, screw you. And then as he's holding the jacket, he begins to sniff and he says, Jesus, you got the crabs? You pissing sulfur or some shit? And the third man with them interjects, at least. Murray got diseases ain't invented yet. Then all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, someone begins to scream and they're saying like, oh no, Jesus shit, ah! And the three men look in the direction of the scream and the one that was sniffing John's jacket says, shit. And the third man says to him, no big thing, Rickles. Them mix popping some dude's cherry again. And Rickles replies, bastards will screw anything. I must have been friggin' crazy staying here. And the third man warns, sleep on your back. So in case you didn't catch it, there was a man being raped somewhere else in this facility, and his screams can be heard by these three guys. But it seems like this is a fairly common occurrence for this facility because the guy talking to Rickles, said sleep on your back very casually. So as Rickles and the third guy are hearing the screams of the man being raped, Murray, the guy that pissed on John, is getting some creepy ideas by this, and he says to the other two men, that's how we ought to do the tourist. Bastard pisses me off. Frickin' pretty boy. Shit, look at his face. You see a guy with a face like that, he's just begging you to screw him up. Ought to do something. But as we turn the page, we cut away from them and that horrific scene to John and JFK walking, and it seems JFK will not shut up because we're seeing John say to himself, this is a bleeding nightmare. And what he's talking about is, I believe JFK only speaks in like presidential speeches. So everything he says has a very authoritative tone, and he's always talking about him being the president of the United States. And we see presently he's saying, it is not the policy of my administration to draw attention to my own personal problems. However, your situation, while extreme, fades into insignificance when compared to mine. And then John looks at the back of JFK's head and he says, point taken, Squire. Here, you don't often get a chance to talk to a famous dead bloke. All right if I ask you something? And JFK answers, this administration prides itself on a policy of openness and accessibility. So John asks, you were in the Navy during the war, weren't you? And you got your back done in by some Japanese shell or something? And JFK answers, that is correct. And John's question continues, yeah, well, I heard you were giving Marilyn one a week or so before Dallas, and you threw the old back wound out, and you had to wear a brace, and you were trying to duck after the first bullet hit you, but the brace held you upright, and the second one blew your brains out. And to this, JFK just stays quiet for a second, and then he answers, no comment. But John just continues to ask another question, saying, all right, what about this one? They're flying you back to Washington after Dallas, and LBJ and his mates are having a party. I mean, he's president now. He's over the bloody moon. So in the middle of it, someone says, where's Johnson? And they search up and down the plane, but they can't find him. And eventually, someone looks in the bit they're keeping you in, and there he is, pissed as a fart, laughing his head off, and screwing the hole in the back of your head. And he's going, who's laughing now, Jack? Who's laughing now? And once again, JFK responds, no comment. And then he adds, I see no point in continuing this line of questioning. In fact, I must announce the tactlessness and cruelty you are displaying. And John replies, suit yourself, mate. It's my favorite one, that is. Just taking the piss. I find it helps at times like these. And then it seems because John said times like these, it kind of snaps him back into thinking about why all this is happening. So as we turn the page, we see his face is all serious now, and his narration says, that's right, isn't it? I do take the piss. More than that, I can be a right bastard when I want to be. That's what they all say. John Constantine, he's a shifty little sod. He'll sell you down the river as soon as look at you, he would. For Christ's sake, that's what keeps me going. But in the 3 weeks since I got off the streets, I've been going around full of joys and spring and happy to be alive. And so whatever this is that's clobbered me, whenever it came, I wasn't friggin' ready. And as John is thinking this, JFK stops walking and he says to John, I feel it appropriate to make a statement at this time. And as John looks back at him, he says, the widespread rumor, speculation, and slander that has occurred since the incident in Dallas you refer to has at its core the assumption that this administration was in some way the last hope for fairness and decency in America. It is this assumption, more accurately, accusation, that has kept me in personal, spiritual, and spatial limbo over 30 years. And I would like to therefore take this opportunity to deny this accusation as strongly as possible. So just in case you missed it through all that presidential speak, JFK is saying that the reason he has had to stay in this hell limbo is because of all of America thinking that JFK was this country's last hope. And I guess that hope has kept him here and made it so he can't move on. So in that little speech, he was saying that it's not true, he's not that great of a guy, and in fact, he was not the last hope of America. So John turns to JFK and asks, so you were actually a bit of a git? And JFK answers, to be seen in a historical context as the conscience of the United States is not the honor one might think. It is, in fact, a burden, and one that I was, at the time, loath to shoulder. My chief concerns were to set the record straight, immediate political survival, and regular extramarital sex with as many women as possible. And John says to that, it doesn't take a genius to work that out, chum. And for Christ's sake, stop talking like you're at a bloody press conference. And JFK replies, this perception of my administration, however, has persisted in the minds of most Americans, apparently in the face of considerable evidence to the contrary, and as my reputation and image have remained unchanged, so has my situation. And John says to him, well, that's what we're going to try and sort out, isn't it? Anyway, people like to believe that bollocks. Helps to think someone tried to stop all the shittiness there is today. Nobody likes the truth. You know what I mean? And as John says, you know what I mean, we get a panel where John literally just turned and walked away from JFK, but JFK is holding his head. So it's kind of like John is commenting about how JFK isn't willing to face the truth himself when it comes to hearing about his own death. Then as we turn the page, we cut to the tribe of Native American skeletons that we had seen in the very first issue of this as the witch walking began. And they have heard of John's arrival as they were one of the people they showed pass on the message that John was here. And we see them riding their skeleton horses through deserts and canyons. They are all in silhouettes, but they have kind of the traditional Native American headdresses and whatnot in order to identify them as that. And the narration says, history split and one last tribe rode through the gap. Then we get some talking of these Native Americans to each other, but we don't see who's saying it. There's just a couple floating bubbles of them discussing what they should do about John, and these words are floating over the panels of them riding in silhouette across the canyons and deserts. So one of them says, he is a forked tongue, and another says, of course he is. What white man is not? And the first man responds, this one is worse. He lives in the night. He fights with shadow. Why do we go to show him visions? And the other man replies, the fifth world. And the first man responds, that talk is madness. The fifth world died at Wounded Knee. What hope have we of ghost dancing, we who are less than ghosts? And the other man answers, all we have is the hope of peace. And the first man asks, for peace we go to a white man? And the second man responds, what choice do we have? He has come from other lands. He must know the way out. He can show us. We will give him visions and hope he will give us pity. A good man could do no other. And the first man replies, there is such a thing as a good white man? And the second man answers, we must hope. Then we cut back to John and JFK, and we can see JFK pointing in a direction and saying, Washington. But John is kind of confused because he says, you joking? We've only been walking a few hours. And JFK replies, I can speak with 100% confidence on this issue, and the facts will back me up. I walked from Dallas to New York in 6 hours today. Time and distance are undergoing several sweeping across-the-board changes. And John thinks about this, and his narration says, "He's right. I got from one end of Manhattan to the other in no time. Everything's smaller, reduced to meanings, to symbols." And as he's thinking that, John walks by what looks like a big thistle of rose bushes. But then the rose bushes begin to talk, and they say, "Hey, I gave him the flower. At the Peace March, I was so stoned. They were going to charge us. No one would move. Air like a razor. I walked out, little me and this huge guy and his baton, and I gave him the flower. Beautiful." And what this man is talking about is from the March on the Pentagon in 1967, when there was a bunch of soldiers that were trying to block some of these protesters. And one of the protesters, I guess this young man, went up to one of the soldiers and put a flower into the rifle barrel of that soldier's weapon. And then that picture was like very famous, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. But now it seems in this hell dimension, this young man that was at this iconic moment is being wrapped and tortured by rose bushes. And as John looks at the peaceful young man getting wrapped by all these bushes, he cynically says, "So much for the 60s. Then as we turn the page, we cut to John and JFK, and they've obviously walked a little bit further, and now they're at a giant flagpole that's in the middle of a field. And on the top of that flagpole is the United States of America flag, and it is gigantic because this flagpole is probably 10 John Constantines wide at the base. And there's a soldier sitting at the base, and he's singing, "If the Army and the Navy ever gaze on heaven's scenes, they will find the streets are guarded by United States Marines." And we see this soldier is sitting in a cross-legged position at the base of this flagpole, and he is wearing a very worn and ragged uniform, and he is holding an M16, and it seems like this is definitely a Vietnam soldier. And he is looking down into his lap, so we can't really see his face, but he does hear John and JFK approaching, and he says, "Sir?" But John just walks past him, but JFK does stop at the soldier, and the soldier says to him, "We took it, sir. We took heaven, and we held it. Ain't it beautiful?" And JFK says to the man, I regret to announce that this is not, but he's cut off by the soldier, who looks up from his lap, and we see that the soldier has no eyeballs, like they've been exploded in his skull. And he says, "Please don't say that." And John, who's just waiting impatiently for JFK, says to him, "Come on, for Christ's sake." So JFK, I guess, just leaves the man there, because as we turn the page, we see John and JFK are approaching the White House. And as they get closer, John turns to JFK and says, "Just a minute here. This is where we sort out your problem, right? What about me?" And JFK replies, "The terms of our agreement state that you will help me oust the president incumbent and thereby regain my presidency. In return, I will lead you to the executive agency restraining you within the borders of this country. As ultimate power in the United States resides within the walls of the White House, I have in no way violated any articles of our agreement." And then he begins to walk off in a different direction than the White House itself. And as he does this, John says, "So I'm supposed to help you throw this bloke out on his arse and then ask him for help? Bloody stroll on." And as JFK walks away, he says, "That assumption is fundamentally flawed. Executive power and the presidency are by no means one and the same. It was this dilemma, in fact, which led to the incident in Dallas mentioned earlier in our ongoing dialogue." And John is following slowly behind JFK as he's walking behind some bushes. And as John rounds one of those bushes, he sees JFK standing in front of some sort of ladder that goes underground. And JFK says to him, "And I have, incidentally, located our means of gaining access." And John replies, "Sound. You go first." So they go down the ladder, and at the bottom, it's just pitch black. And John says to JFK, "Handy little tunnel this. Bloke could nip out, have his end away, and be home before the First Lady knew he was gone." And JFK replies, "This administration strenuously denies such allegations and condemns them as mere scandal." And John sarcastically says, "Knew you'd see the funny side." And at this moment, John pulls out a lighter from his pocket, and he lights it so there's no more darkness in the area below this ladder. And as they look into the darkness, John says, "Getting wider. So, this, what was it? Executive power, what's it, spoke to you, did it?" And as they walk into the darkness, with nothing but the light from the lighter, JFK says, "That is correct. But once they walk a couple steps, John notices that the ground doesn't feel right, and he says, "Shut up a minute. What are we standing in here?" And in the panel, we can see what he's looking at is the walls and floor of this place look like they're made of meat. Like if John and JFK are standing in the center of an esophagus or some sort of tube or tunnel made of flesh. And as John realizes this, he gets off balance because the floor is all uneven and fleshy, and he falls down and he exclaims, "Shit, friggin' hell," as he lands face first into whatever this flesh is. And then a ghostly voice says, "You are standing in my heart. You are breaking it." And at the mention of breaking it, we turn the page and we see a full page splash of John being freaked out as the walls above him begin to bleed and what looks like shards of bones begin to fall from the ceiling. Then we cut to Papa Midnight, who has been following John's adventures in this hell dimension by staring into his sister's skull. So she was the window into this weird hell dimension, and she was also the voice that just spoke to John. And apparently before she did that, she was able to stop Papa Midnight from seeing it. So as he stares in anger at his sister's skull, he says, "Sister, you are supposed to be my eyes in hell, and now you say I am blind? What are you doing?" And just like before, we don't hear her side of this conversation because she's just a skull, but Papa Midnight is hearing her respond to him inside his head. And so he answers her saying, "I know hell is not a constant. I know. I am having too good a day watching Constantine suffer to have it ruined by some storm in the inferno. Give me my entertainment back." And then she says something to him that he doesn't like, and he says, "What?" And when he doesn't get an answer back, he looks very alarmed and he says, "No, don't ignore me, Sedella. Don't. Then we cut back to the inside of this flesh cave that John is in. And now the whole floor is covered with blood, and John is like still kind of wading in it as he tries to get up. And it's gross because he got some in his mouth, so he has to spit that out. And as he stands, he says, "Ugh, shit, bloody hell." And then he remembers JFK and says, "You there? Oi, where are you?" But when he turns around, he sees JFK is face first in the blood. And it seems like he either got hit on the head or something and he's passed out, or maybe he can't stand up because of the injuries he suffered. But John sees him and he says, "Oh, for freak's sake." So he goes over to help JFK up. And the second that his head gets above the surface, he says to John, "The administration extends its thanks for," but JFK is cut off by a woman saying, "You took longer than expected. It hurts to wait, but I am used to it." And as John and JFK turn to the woman speaking, we see the floating body of Sedella, and she is wrapped in a yellow light. And like we saw from the first page of this story arc, she's an African-American woman, and she's wearing a piece of pink fabric that's wrapped around her body, and she has long hair that has turned white. And John says to her, "Right, well, we didn't know we were trespassing, love. We'll just be on our way." But Sedella replies, "No, I brought you here, John Constantine. I need you." And John starts to get mad and he says, Do you know what you've, but then he stops himself and his narration says, "The words stick. I don't think I've got the bloody words to yell and hate and damn and accuse." And Sedella replies, "No, I am Sedella. I brought you here to my heart. The man who took you witch-walking, who sent you to this America, is my brother, and you know him, Midnight." And hearing that name, John gets super mad, and you can see his face fill with fury, and his narration says, "And the words stick again. But this time, it's because I don't know swear words bad enough, and using the ones I know would keep me here all day. Midnight, a 2-bit mumbo-jumbo slaphead, and he did this to me? I was right earlier on. I wasn't ready. If I was, the bastard wouldn't have gotten near me, which means the biggest arsehole of all is..." And then John closes his eyes and calms himself down as if to say, "Me." So John actually walks over to one of the fleshy walls of this tunnel and he leans against it, putting his head on his arm. And his narration says, "This voice in the back of my head is going, 'That's what happens when you let your guard down, Johnny boy. You're pouncing about like a kid, full of this regaining the will to live bollocks. What'd you think? Everyone else stops playing the game because you do? Serves you right." And John says out loud, "Shit." And then JFK begins to talk behind him, I guess trying to ease the blow, saying, "Despite the blow to personal," but John cuts him off saying, "Sod off, will you? Just leave me alone." But Sedella interjects between them, saying, "I brought you here for a reason. You have been wronged, but not as badly as me. Midnight is my brother. One day he brought me a present. Then we turn the page and we get a giant panel of Papa Midnight as a young boy slashing the throat of his sister. And he is looking like he's in full voodoo ceremonial garb. He's got little skulls on a necklace around his neck, and it looks like he's wearing some sort of white vest as well. And he has a white skull painted over his face. Then we cut back to Sedella explaining to John, I was dead and not dead. I was kept from moving on. For 10 nights, he spoke the words and cut my body into shapes. I felt his hands in my soul, making it what it was not. He proclaimed himself Hungin Voodoo King, and I woke up in hell. I was made a whore to the lords of hell, and what they whispered in their sleep, I told him every word. A little of their power I stole for him, and he climbed to the top of the world. But only now has he sent another to hell. Only now do I have a chance to talk to a magus. And to this, John replies, barking up the wrong tree there, love. And Sedella looks at him, not amused, and says, no matter. You know magic. You know what has to be done to me. Can you help me? And to this question, John replies, can you get me out of here? And Sedella answers, I can. Then with a smile on his face, John lights a cigarette, and he begins to think. And we can see the wheels turning in his head as he says to Sedella, I don't know much about voodoo, but all magic works around knowledge. Midnight's your brother. He knew you inside out. Be no stopping him. It takes a mark on the spirit to send an innocent to hell. That'll be what you felt him doing. And Sedella asks, can you remove it? And John takes another puff of his cigarette and he says, show me your soul. And by the way, it'll hurt. And as she reveals her soul to him, he takes the cigarette from his mouth and he holds the lit end towards her and he moves forward slowly to burn the mark off her soul. And we just get a black panel underneath this of her screaming in agony. And as John hears this scream, he has to cover his ears because it's so loud. And John's narration says, sometimes, right, when you're really sick, they'll operate on you knowing the surgery will leave you a wreck. But they do it anyway, because what the hell? It'll be better than the state you're in, and you can always heal. Easy for them to say. So John turns to Sedella now that she has been freed from the spell, and she looks pretty rough because whatever that pain was really took it out of her. But John doesn't seem to care about her recovery. He just stands up and lights another cigarette and says, right, how do I get out? And Sedella looks up at him and says, we can leave together. My brother witch-walked you in here. You can leave any time, provided you know the way out. I can show you. And as we turn the page, we cut to the three of them walking out of the tunnel and back up the ladder. And as they're walking, JFK is of course talking, saying, I regret it should be necessary to raise this issue, but the administration has honored its part of the initial agreement and must now ask when you intend to reciprocate. And to this, John says, give me a bleeding chance. And then Sedella says to JFK, we still can. This is just a fraction of hell my brother borrowed with his magic, a reflection of America and what happens there. If you want to get rid of the president of this place, you should stick with us, dead man. He sits at the place where we will be leaving, up here. And then Sedella begins to climb the ladder, and as she does, John says, so this other president, he's in the White House now, is he? And Sedella replies, he is. And John asks, who is he? And Sedella answers, I don't know. This place reflects America's dark side. Who rules it, I cannot begin to guess. And then as John climbs the ladder behind her, he says, 10-1 it's bloody Nixon. So they all climb the ladder, and as Sedella stands on the grass outside waiting for John, we get a panel of John looking out just past her legs, but we don't see what he's seeing, and he just says, Sedella? And as we turn to the last page of the issue, we get a full page splash of the band of Native American skeletons arriving on their skeleton horses just in time for John to get out of the tunnel. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.